Censorship reform next. This was relaxed after Alexander's accession to the throne, but when control over censorship passed to Valuev, the Minister of the Interior, and his ministry in 1863, the system became tighter. Then in 1865, the progressive press laws were published, freeing some works from preliminary censorship before publication, which was especially hated. Foreign publications could be sold in Russia with government approval, and the legal system allowed challenges to censorship. In 1865, the press was allowed to print editorials with comment on government policy, but censorship started to bite hard again in the last years of the reign, and even then it wasn't as hard as Nicholas I's reign. Sometimes censors made mistakes, like when Chernyshevsky's "What is to be done" was let through, which incited peasants to rebellion. The limitations of censorship reform. Censorship remained strict. In 1866, the radical journal The Contemporary was banned, for example. Still both military and church censorship, and it was very strict compared to, say, British standards. The growth in critical writing encouraged a clampdown on all writing in the 1870s. The effects of censorship, or lack of censorship, or censorship reform. The number of books published per year doubled between 1855 and 1864, and trebled between 1865 and 81. For example, over 10,000 books published in 1894. The mood of cooperation between publisher and censor existed rather than the previous repression. There's a considerable increase in freedom of ideas and expression of them, and the beginning of Russian journalism and educated public opinion happened. This all led to a criticism of the Tsarist abuses, which led to a tightening up, which led to then increased criticism, and so on, like a vicious cycle. Overall discontent grew on both sides. Nationalities and ethnic groups. There's initial relaxation in Poland. In Finland, there were concessions like a diet, which is a type of council, and the Finnish language was encouraged, and there was liberalisation of Jews. The limitations, though, were that liberal policy in Poland was reversed after the 1863 revolt, which was crushed by severe fighting in 1864. Russification was then imposed. The name of Poland was changed to Vistula province, and 10,000 of the rebellion's proponents were exiled. The liberal policy towards the Jews was also halted after 1866, and attitudes towards Finns also became more hostile, although it wasn't until Alexander III that Russification really flourished as a government policy. The effects of the reforms of the nationalities. The early Polish reforms whetted the appetite for more, which were then obviously rejected and caused revolt and then rebellion, and the Poles were continuously rebellious until 1917. The policies towards the Finnish were reasonably successful until the later Russification policies of Alexander III, and the reactionary policies toward nationalities after the slight reform and relaxation only heightened the discontent within Russia, especially of intellectuals. Let's have a look at the effects of the reforms on various groups. Peasants saw some benefit from law changes. They saw some education, some representation in local zemstvos. Few went to the junker schools, but at least they didn't have to serve a life sentence in the army or navy. Censorship rarely affected them, and their lives, apart from the redemption payments, changed a little as the daily grind and continued population explosion led to increased hardship. Some became kulaks, and some became landless, but these were not the groups that were calling for reform. Intellectuals were affected by judicial and educational reforms, which increased the number of middle classes. They wanted more reform. The reforms had given them hope, and the exemption had given them a place to discuss their hopes. And relaxed censorship gave them the means to, and increased education also helped them to discuss them. When reform then stopped, many who had little or no political power in the zemstvos became revolutionary. The liberal nobles, it gave them an appetite for more reform. Reactionary nobles were angry due to loss of land and their privileges in the army taken away. Zemstva was good for most nobles of both reactionary and reforming persuasion, as it gave them more say, although it was still restricted in parts. Military reforms were accepted after 1871, as were the economic reforms. Why did Alexander stop reforming, and how much did he stop? Different areas saw reform and reaction at different times. For example, the Nationalities saw a reaction as early as 1863 after the Polish Revolt, when he was still reforming in other areas like local government and education. This is because there was no plan behind them, and they were a haphazard and contradictory attempt to increase Russia's modernisation without affecting political stability and autocracy. Some reforms carried on going, like economic reform and military reform, and were backed by the Tsar throughout. Most reforming stopped abruptly after the first assassination attempt in 1866, when the Tsar appointed 4 reactionaries, including Shuvalov, Tolstoy and Palin. By then, the most of the principal reforms were done, and it was difficult to justify further reform in the context of modernising Russia without losing his political control. His relationship with Katerina Dolgoruki made him more distant from the liberal reformers in his old family, who criticised him for this, and he became more aloof. The continued assassination attempts gave the reactionaries more ammunition to attack his liberal policies. However, after the 1877-78 Turkish War, which despite being won was brought about by a slow victory, caused famine and industrial recession, repression increased but then only led to further attempts on his life. So therefore, in 1880, Alexander set up a commission under Loris Malikov to investigate the best way to reduce revolutionary activity. Malikov would only accept the position on his own terms, which gave him sweeping powers. Loris Malikov advocated less repression and a relaxation of the repression and reaction. Press restriction was relaxed. He gave the Zemstvos power back. The release of prisoners, political prisoners. The third section was abolished, and the Okhrana was set up, which became just as feared in time. Finally, Loris Malikov produced a report in 1880 designed to meet the demands of the Zemstva for elected representation at a national level to discuss economic and administrative reform, although this was to be very limited. It was what the radicals were asking for. Alexander signed this report the very day he died in 1881. How successful were the reforms and how much impact did they have? Well, it depends on the angle you look at it. Economic success and some minor successes and some people's lives were saved or made better by the reforms, but the military was still weak, the peasants were still not becoming entrepreneurs, and this taster of reform led people in the liberal nobility and the middle-class intellectuals to want more, like a National Duma, for example, as well as giving them the opportunity to criticise it for the first time. It led to opposition and assassination attempts, and then a reaction or reactionary approach by the Tsar and more repression. This led in turn to more criticism and overall more discontentment. Overall, it can be seen as a failure as the reforms fell between two stools. Did the reform do what the Tsar wanted it to do? No. Was he, though, the Tsar liberator? Yes, he implemented far more reaching reform than any of the predecessors, with the possible exception of Peter the Great. This included the abolition of the death penalty, serfdom, equality before the law was established, and trial by jury was established. The revitalisation of the army and the economy. Russia was transformed from a semi-feudal society into what is now considered a modern state. On the other hand, no. He stopped just when people wanted more and actually weakened the country by becoming reactionary after 1866, when he had already opened the floodgates. Did he open the floodgates by too many reforms? Could he stop calls for more once he started? Could he have ignored the need for some reform after the Crimean War? Should he have gone the whole way in 1860 to constitutional monarchy? But was Russia ready for this? And you could argue, was he about to succeed when he died? Some historians have even suggested that the Tsar didn't really understand what he was doing, but he had tried to do what was best for his country and his dynasty, modernise Russia and keep autocracy strong. And doing both of them was probably an impossible task.